It's the 2022 World Cup. It's the squad update for Spain. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and today we'll be updating Spain's squad for the 2022 World Cup. Well, the final selections have been out for a little while, and this is the promised update mediacast where we look at the selections, the non-selections, the surprises, and the injury updates that we made in our full team podcast, where we went through all candidates and gave career and participation for participation information and predicted each player's likelihood of making the squad. So today we'll check how accurate our predictions were and we'll update recent games. Check the show notes for links to that full player podcast as well as the group media cast where we took a close look at the teams, their history and their chances in this tournament. All right, let's get started with Spain. Just a quick note though, if you want the short version, you can jump to the end where we give a summary of selections and injuries and reassess our predictions of the starters. So, all right, well, I am wearing I'm wearing a shirt in memory of the famous incident known to few, in fact, the 1587 incident between Spain and Canada, where a group of Canadian pirates ambitiously attacked a Spanish galleon carrying gold back to Spain. And, you know, they got on board with their grappling hooks and it looked like a big fight was going to break out. And instead, a soccer game broke out. So this was considered to be the first soccer game of history actually invented by the Canadians and the Spanish, working things out. There were swords involved, but also a ball of sorts. And this story is not in any history books. It comes down through one of the men on the ship, the port midfielder, who affectionately is known by his crewmates as Pierre the Fabricator. And okay, none of that is true. There's no such story. I'm just making up a story to cover the fact that I don't have a Spanish shirt and have to wear this Canadian shirt instead. I apologize, Spanish fans. At least I went for the same colors, though, as the Spanish shirt, so I think I should get some credit for that. All right, let's move on to formations, and we are focused on the recent friendlies, the 2 games in September and 1 game in November, and but we are going to kind of look at the lineups, and this is pretty easily done. Their formation is always a 4-3-3. So we don't need to talk that much about that, and it's pretty easy to kind of envision where the players line up on the field. But we will talk a little bit about those games. So, sorry, they weren't friendlies in September. They were 2 Nations League games. The last 2 Nations League games, the first 4 having been played in June. The first September game was at home, but it was a 2-1 loss to Switzerland, and the second one was away in Portugal, and that was a 1-0 win. And in terms of their Nations League, then they finished first in their group ahead of Portugal, Switzerland, and Czech Republic. The November game was a kind of a preparation game in Jordan against Jordan, and it was a 3-0 win. Again, a 4-3-3 lineup there. And in all 3 of those games, the players we saw were not experimentative. Generally, these were all players intended for the World Cup squad. And we're going to see as we go here that a lot of times they're rotating positions. So all of those players were kind of starters or potential starters in terms of that rotation. So a few things worked out. You know, Emerick Laporte, for example, came back from injury, so was kind of tried out in the November game as a substitute, and a couple of small things like that kind of working out some details, but certainly not kind of searching for players in the September or November game. Okay, let's move on, and we'll talk about the squad. So we have basically the list that we had from the previous podcast, where we categorize players into their likelihood of making the squad. So definite, likely, possible but unlikely, and so on. So now we're going to go through that squad and say which ones made it. So we'll begin by first listing names, and then we will say who made it and who didn't. Spain did have a 45-man preliminary squad, so we'll also say which players made that preliminary squad too. And we'll finish with kind of a summary of the position. And then at the end of the media cast, at the very end, we go through that list again and predict starters. We did that for the full version, but maybe we got some insights that make us rethink our opinion. So that'll end the podcast here. I keep saying podcast, but I'm supposed to say media cast because it includes the YouTube, YouTube. So anyway, we do have manager Luis Enrich, and we went through some of the managers prior to him, but we'll keep it short here. Luis Enrich has been manager of the national team since 2019. And so we consider him as having made the squad. Spain has in the past actually gotten rid of managers shortly before, so it wasn't guaranteed. Okay, for goalkeepers, we have two candidates as definite. That's Unai Simon and Robert Sanchez. Likely candidate, David Rea. Possible but unlikely candidates, David De Gea and Arnaud Tenas, and seemingly off the squad, Kepa Arrizabalaga. So despite a valiant effort and a few good games with Chelsea, I think in October, Kepa Arrizabalaga was not selected, and nor were the two possible but unlikely candidates, David De Gea and Arnaud Tenas. So that leaves the three candidates who made the squad: Unai Simon and Robert Sanchez and David Rea. And we'll summarize the position by saying Simon has always been the starter, which is actually rarely the case with Spain, who seem to rotate all positions except for goalkeeper, or most positions. Simon started all the games except for a single friendly, as we noted in the previous podcast. In the recent games, it was Simon in the September friendlies, those Nations League games, but Robert Sanchez got a start in the November friendly. So we'll see at the end whether that affects our prediction that we made in the previous mediacast. Okay, let's move on to the defense, central defenders. So we have a definite candidate in Pau Torres, three likely candidates in Eric Garcia, Emerick Laporte, and Inigo Martinez, and one possible candidate in Diego Llorente, and two players seemingly off the squad, Raul Albiol and Sergio Ramos. Again, we gave all the biographical information on these players in the full-length podcast, so we're just dealing with names here. In terms of the players who made it, so Pau Torres, the definite candidate, did make it. Eric Garcia, Emerick Laporte, two of the likely candidates made it, but Inigo Martinez did not. He was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut. A possible candidate, Diego Llorente, same thing. He made the preliminary squad, but not the final cut. And that was the case too with Sergio Ramos, who we thought was off the squad, but he was named to the preliminary squad, but is not going to be at the cup. Finally, Raul Albiol was not selected even for the preliminary squad. So that leaves us with just the three candidates there: Pau Torres, Eric Garcia, and Emerick Laporte as central defenders. And we'll finish by summarizing the position. It seems Laporte is used when available, but it's been before the selection of a rotation of these three players, as well as Llorente, who wasn't selected. Um, in the September games, it was Pau Torres twice, and he was paired with Garcia in the first game, and actually defensive midfielder Hugo Guillamon in the second September friendly. So I wonder if it's going to be out of, well, it would have to be out of position players as backup. I'm surprised they brought so few central defenders. Laporte was back for the November friendly, but to my surprise, he played left back. And it was Garcia and Torres who played in the center. So we'll talk about how that affects our view of the possible starters at the end. Okay, well, moving on to left backs, we do have Jordi Alba as a definite candidate and Marcos Alonso as a likely candidate, and possible candidates Jose Luis Gea and Sergio Reguilon. And Jordi Alba did make the squad, the definite candidate. However, surprisingly, Marcos Alonso, the likely candidate, did not. So that kind of went against our expectations. Jose Luis Gea did make the squad, but I have more to say about that. And Sergio Reguilon did not. He was struggling with a bit of injury. But it's difficult to say whether the injury or simple non-selection was the reason. So, yes, we said we would update that. And so I should actually update it. He had a groin muscle injury since May with an unknown return date when we did the initial podcast. He did return in late October, but he had last played for the national team a full year earlier. So he was probably barely considered. And we have to rule this as a selection decision since he was off the injury list and was not selected. So that's Sergio Reguilon. Meanwhile, Jose Luis Gea was selected for the squad, and he picked up an ankle injury in training. So that was after he flew to Qatar to train with Spain. And it was only a 10-day injury, not a serious injury, but it does rule him out of 2 games. So he was replaced, and he was replaced by the new candidate, Alexandro Balde. So Alexandro Balde kind of coming into the squad as a replacement, and Jose Luis Gea out. All right, well, let's summarize the position here. So really it was Alonso and Marcos Alonso and Alba sharing the position. Typically, or traditionally, it's Jordi Alba's position. But as I said, Spain seemed to be rotating a lot of positions. And it was Jordi Alba and Gea who played the September friendlies, 1 each. And as we mentioned, Emerick Laporte played the position in the November friendly. So Alonso was conspicuously absent even from the September games. He wasn't called up, so the writing on the wall was kind of there that he wouldn't be selected. Okay, let's move on to right backs. And here we have a definite candidate in Cesar Azpilicueta, and a likely candidate in Dani Carvajal, and a possible candidate in Pedro Porro. So Cesar Azpilicueta did make the squad, and Dani Carvajal was also selected, but Pedro Porro was not selected, not even for the preliminary squad. So that leaves us these 2 candidates. And in summary of the position, once again, we see the position kind of being shared or rotated prior to the or up to the June 2022 games. And then the same continued into the recent friendlies with Azpilicueta and Carvajal, each starting one of the September friendlies, and it was Carvajal in the November friendly. Okay, on to midfielders and the defensive midfielders. We have definite candidates Sergi Busquets and Rodri, and as a possible candidate, Hugo Guillamon. So let's see who made it, and it was Sergio Busquets making the final squad, and Rodri, both of them, and Hugo Guillamon also made the squad. So I wonder if he is kind of a backup central defender there too. Okay, so all of them making it, and we won't summarize the position until we cover the central midfielders here, because the positions overlap to a degree. For the central midfielders, we have definite candidates in Carlos Soler and Gavi. Well, Gavi is denoted as a central midfielder, but we are going to move him to right midfielder for the discussion there. So definite candidate, but we'll discuss him under right midfielders. Okay, so let's go back, and we have likely candidate Marcos Llorente, but we're going to move him to right midfielders here also. Okay, so that leaves us with possible candidate Sergi Roberto, and we have possible but unlikely candidates Mikel Merino and Fabian Ruiz. And then we have Thiago Alcantara, who we put as seemingly off the squad. So indeed, he is off the squad. He was not selected, so we'll remove him from the list. And Fabian Ruiz was not selected even for the preliminary squad. Mikel Merino was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut. And the same is true of Sergi Roberto, but an injury played into it, so I'll just update that injury. He was out with a muscle injury problem in mid-September, but actually he recovered from that and returned to play in early October. However, he was then hit with a shoulder injury in late October and has been out since then. So he was never a strong candidate, as you can see, just a possible level here. So it's tough to say if he would have made the squad, but that injury kind of put the matter to rest. So among the central midfielders, we only have Carlos Soler left standing. But now let's summarize the position of defensive and central midfielder. So it's Busquets and Rodri. They rotated fairly evenly with Koke making the odd appearance there. And this is the way it was too in the recent friendlies, with Busquets and Rodri each starting one of the September friendlies, and Koke starting the November friendly. So I'm beginning to see that November friendly as slightly experimental, but experimenting with players who would be brought to the World Cup. So a few players, for example, playing out of position and the like. Although Koke has played as the central midfielder before, I hasten to add. All right, let's move on to left midfielders. And we've moved a couple of players into this position. So before I list the candidates, I will go and get those players. And we're going to deal with Koke here, as well as Pedri. So let me just fetch them from below. So we have definite candidate Koke and likely candidate Pedri, and we will move them up to the left midfielder position. And the other candidate we have is seemingly off the squad, Marc Cucurella, who I believe plays as a left back for Chelsea. But here he is coded as a left midfielder, and we don't need to talk about him because he wasn't selected even for the preliminary squad. So that leaves us with Koke, who was selected for the final squad, as well as Petri, who was also selected. So let's talk about the position, and you'll understand why I put them here to make the discussion easier. Actually, if you imagine the 4-3-3, we're talking about the middle line, the middle three on the left side there. So we talked about the center, where Koke sometimes turned up, but he turns up here too. So in fact, a variety of players played in the position, making it kind of complex to summarize in the main podcast, but we will focus on the September games here. The rotation of the main names continued in the recent friendlies, with Pedri and Koke each playing one of the September friendlies as left midfielder, and Solar taking the position in the November friendly. Solar, who we met, yes, who we met as a central midfielder there. Okay, so Solar playing left midfield as well as right midfield, so we left him as under central midfielders. Let's move on to right midfielders, and it's similar. We've got to do the candidates. So we have a definite candidate in Gavi, and a likely candidate in Marcos Llorente, and a possible but unlikely candidate in Brais Mendes. And Gavi did make the final squad. Marcos Llorente also selected. Brais Mendes selected for the preliminary squad, but not making the cut to the final squad. So two players here, and similar to the left side with three players sharing the position. Solar is one of them, so more than most, he kind of jumps from the left to the right. The other two candidates here are the two we've mentioned, Gavi and Marcos Llorente. So we will come back and predict the starter among those three. And we move on. Okay, and then in the main podcast, we gave the reason why we changed things up a little bit for Spain, putting left wingers in the forward part of the field. So again, it's all because of the 4-3-3, and if you think about it, there is no left winger or right winger position in that 4-3-3. So the position kind of translate to the right forward and left forward. So if a winger is on the field, they'll usually be playing as the left or right forward. Okay, so we have the candidates here, Mikel Oyarzabal at the possible level, and then we have Bryan Gil at the possible but unlikely level. So again, these players are actually not used, but there's a couple of notes on them. So Mikel Oyarzabal made the preliminary squad, but he was an injury concern. He was out with a cruciate ligament injury since March. And when we did the main podcast, he was expected back in mid-October. However, that injury has continued until the present. So he wasn't available for the World Cup. Still on the injury list, Mikel Oyarzabal, so not selected for the squad, despite being selected for the preliminary squad. Bryan Gil was not selected even for the preliminary squad, but we do have a new candidate here, a new player added in Ansu Fati, and we didn't cover him in the main podcast, so we'll give a little information on him. Ansu Fati first appeared for Spain in September 2020 and actually played 4 games there and was on the bench for one. But after that, by November 2020, he was out with injury, and that was a really long injury. It went on for a whole year, and then he got another injury, a hamstring injury. So he didn't reappear on the national team until June 2022. And then for 3 of those 4 Nations League games in June, he was on the bench. He didn't see any field time. He wasn't selected for the September games, but he was brought in for the November game and actually started as a left forward there. So Ansu Fati has 5 caps now since 2020 and 1 goal, and he is 20 years old and plays for Barcelona in Spain. Let's move on to right wingers then, and the first thing we're going to do is actually move Ferran Torres from the right winger role to the left forward role, and we gotta make that category on the graphic. But I'm going to divide players into left and right forward for Spain. I should have done that in the previous podcast as well, just to kind of help with the discussion, because it's actually kind of tricky to keep track of the Spanish players because they all move around the field so much. Okay, right wingers, we have possible candidate then, Yeremy Pino, and seems to be off the squad, Adama Traore. And Adama Traore is off the squad, not named even to the preliminary squad. Yeremy Pino was an injury risk. He was out with an ankle injury in June, but he did return to action in late September, and he participated in the recent friendlies. So now he is off the list, and he was selected for the final squad. And we also have a new candidate here, and that is Nico Williams. So Nico Williams got his first cap in September 2022, and he didn't start either of the remaining 2 games there, but he was subbed in for both matches. So that gives him 2 caps since 2022, and he also is 20 years old, and he plays for Atletico Bilbao in Spain. So our second new candidate there. And let's talk a little bit about the position of right wing and left wing. So as I said before, the position is always kind of translates into left forward and right forward because of the 4-3-3 formation that they always use. And actually, I don't have any more to say about it. What I want to say will actually come under the right forward position. So let's move on, and we will talk about attacking midfielders, but we've already talked about a few of these. So definite candidate Koke, we covered under left midfielders, and definite candidate Pablo Sarabia, we are going to move to the left forward position here. So Pablo Sarabia, a left forward primarily. We also have Pedro, the likely candidate Pedro, but we're going to move him to left. We already talked about him under left midfielder. And Marco Asenio will keep here as an attacking midfielder, but you should know that recently he's been playing as a centre forward. So again, kind of tricky to organize the Spanish team here. So we have Marco Asenio as a possible candidate, and we have Pablo Fornals and Brahim Diaz as possible but unlikely. And we have Sergio Canales, who seems to be off the squad. And all 3 of those players were not selected even for the preliminary squad. So we will remove Pablo Fornals, Brahim Diaz, and Sergio Canales from the list. And that has reduced our long list to simply Marco Asenio, who is selected for the final squad. Okay, and then a summary of this position. Basically, it doesn't exist in a 4-3-3. So as you see by our moving of players around, players who are coded as attacking midfielder may play in the central midfield, or may play as one of the outside forwards, or even as the centre forward, as Marco Asensio does, as we'll soon see. Okay, let's move on to the left forward position. And we have to make a few changes here. Actually, I mistakenly put Ferran Torres as a left forward, but should have put him as a right forward. And we're also going to move the candidate listed as a forward, Dani Olmo, we're going to move him to left forward here. So that leaves us with two candidates, two definite candidates for left forward. That's Dani Olmo and Pablo Sarabia. And we can say that both of those were selected for the final squad. So we'll highlight them in green, and let us summarize the position then. So yes, to June 22, it was usually Sarabia or Olmo. But I'm cleaning that up quite a bit, actually, because a lot of players have stepped in. For example, it was different players in all 5 games of World Cup qualifying. So it's quite confusing. That's why I'm doing all of this moving around to try to make it more understandable. In September, in the September friendlies, it was Sarabia in both of the Nations League games, I should say. And in November, it was Ansu Fati, the new candidate that we saw. And Sarabia did start that November game, but he moved over to the right forward position. So Dani Olmo had returned from injury in November and was called up to the squad, but was used as just a substitute there. So again, we'll see if that changes our view on the starter. We'll talk about that at the end of the podcast. Moving over to right forwards, we have just Ferran Torres here, and he did make the squad. And so I'll describe the position over there. This position is more consistently Ferran Torres, although Sarabia comes over here as well to replace him. So it was Ferran Torres in both of the September friendlies, and as we saw, Pablo Sarabia in the November friendly. So that's what we can kind of expect in the Cup. I would say, something like 2/3 of the time, Torres starting it and 1/3 Sarabia. But again, we'll talk about starters at the end, and we'll move on to our final category, the forwards. And we have a definite candidate in Alvaro Morata. We moved Dani Olmo. So we have a possible candidate in Raul de Thomas. But actually already in the previous podcast, we talked about why he was off the squad. So I'll move him to off the squad, or seemingly off the squad. We do have Rodrigo Moreno in a possible but unlikely category. And then 2 other players who seem to be off the squad, Gerard Moreno and Abel Ruiz. So let's go through and see who made it. Alvaro Morata was selected for the final squad. And I think that's it. Rodrigo Moreno made the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. Same with Gerard Moreno. And Abel Ruiz was not selected for either. Was not selected for the preliminary squad even. And Raul de Thomas, we told his story in the full podcast, basically is banned from playing for his club. And we think that's the reason why he couldn't be selected for the national team, because he wouldn't be playing any club games to keep fit, basically. However, we do have one source that listed him as ineligible, but we don't think ourselves that he was ineligible, just that the manager wouldn't choose a player who was not with a team, was not playing for a team regularly. So Raul de Thomas off the squad, and there we have our list of players who made the squad. So we'll come back to that when we go through the players who we think are going to start. And meanwhile, we'll look at some of the stats on these 26 players. So we did that in the previous podcast, but that was for a larger group of players, including some of the ones that didn't make it here. And so for this squad, we can say the average age is 25.3, which makes them one of the youngest squads in the World Cup here. The average is 27. So we're finding the teams at this World Cup a bit older than previous World Cups, but not Spain. They are 25.3, and the next youngest is 25.6. Ecuador. Oh, wait, USA actually beat Spain with 25.2. So anyway, all three of those quite young compared to other teams. We'll take a closer look at that. We have 3 players who are 33 years old or older. And we have, quite a few. This is why they're so young. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 players who are 22 or younger. So we'll just look at some of these key players here. So the older ones, 33 or older, are Sergio Busquets, Cesar Azpilicueta, and Jordi Alba. Jordi Alba is 33, and the next player after that is 30 years old. So just those 3 kind of at the upper end. And then, wow, just a huge list. I'll just name the main players who are kind of starters. Ferran Torres is 22. Pedri is 19 and Gavi is 18. Those are among the many players they have 22 or younger. So this kind of bodes well for the future for Spain, as well as for the present, because some of those players are starters or kind of rotating starters. Average caps on the team we would expect to be lower because the average age is lower, and it is 28.2. And the average caps among the teams in the cup that I've done so far, so that's about 2/3 of the team, is 34.2. So yeah, it's a little less experience than most teams there. Total number of goals, and this really took me by surprise, 79. So we would expect it to be a bit less, given that they have fewer overall caps, but this is quite a bit less. The average is 119. So this is actually, there are a couple of teams in this range, but they're teams kind of known to have scoring difficulties. So Australia, Japan, teams of that kind. So a bit of a concern there. The average, the total goals per cap is 10.8. So not as low as some teams, because, and that's because they have fewer caps there, 10.8. But the average is 13.5. So this is just kind of a measure of how much the team scores. And there are several teams around 10 or to 11. But again, they tend to be kind of teams that are known to struggle for goals. So I don't particularly see Spain as a team that struggles for goals. But, you know, the data is speaking here. Let's take a closer look at it, at their goal scorers. So we do have Alvaro Morata with 27 goals in 57 games. That's 47%. And Ferran Torres with 13 goals in 31 games. That's 41%. You know, 40% is very good for any player, even for a forward. Pablo Sarabia has 36%. And we won't count Ansu Fati because he has too few caps. We generally need 20 caps to make this a valid statistic. So they are getting their goals from their forwards, so that doesn't really seem to be a concern. You know, and as I said, I don't generally worry about Spain in terms of goals. So I think this is really just a factor of having so many very young players. So a lot of those young players do have a goal, and it'd be like a goal in 3 caps or 2 goals in 5 caps, for example. So yes, I think this may be much ado about nothing, and that the goals statistics are just not looking good in their favor. Anyway, something to keep an eye on, whether Spain does have a scoring problem or not. It never strikes me that they do. or it doesn't strike me that they do. Okay, let's move on to some summaries then. And we have, first of all, notable non-selections. So we're just going to go by names here, unless we didn't talk about them above, but in most cases we did. We have David De Gea. I add him to the list for the sake of other people because we had him as possible but unlikely. But, you know, when I read articles on Spain, there was a lot of hands being thrown up in the air about David De Gea not being selected. But perhaps they didn't know that he had been kind of drifting off the squad ever since the Euro 2020, or even before, arguably. However, we are legitimately surprised by Inigo Martinez not being selected. We had him as a likely candidate, and also Marcos Alonso, his non-selection. As far as surprise inclusions go, we don't really have any surprises. This is usually kind of players coming in from the cold. They played for the team in the past, were off the team for a while, and are now coming back on. None of those. The closest thing we have to that is some new candidates. So we have 3 new candidates, which were introduced in the podcast. And those were Nico Williams, the right winger. Sorry, I'm just adjusting the graphics here. Nico Williams, the right winger, Ansu Fati, the left winger, and Alejandro Balde there also. So let's move to injuries. So updates on injuries. So we have 4 categories here. The first one is players who have recovered from injuries. So first one is Emerick Laporte, and I don't think I talked about him above, so I'll cover it here. He had knee surgery over the summer and was out for the September games. However, he returned in early October as expected and has been playing since he played in the November friendly for Spain. So he is back in action. We have Jeremy Pino. And again, I don't think I said above. So he was out with an ankle injury, but he returned to action in late September, and he participated in the September and November games. And finally, we have Pedri. And again, I didn't mention this. He was out with a hamstring injury for the June games, but he returned to action in September. So no problems for any of those 3 players. Next category is injury doubts. That is players that they brought to the tournament with an injury in hopes that they would recover, but there are no players on Spain in that situation. Next is players dropped due to injury. And we really don't have any big players, and we wonder whether these players would have been selected anyway. But anyway, Mikel Oyarzabal is in this category. Brian Gil. So Mikel Oyarzabal we had as a possible candidate. Brian Gil we had as possible but unlikely. And Jose Luis Gaya is probably actually the player we should put here because he was selected for the squad and then was replaced, actually got injured in training with Spain for the World Cup. So Jose Luis Gaya. Okay, and finally we have players who were injured but not strong candidates. So I probably should have put Brian Gil in this category. So I'll actually move him because he was possible but not likely. We also have Sergio Reguilon, who seemed to actually recover from his injury. So technically it should be just a non-selection rather than not selected due to injury. And then we have Sergi Roberto, who was we considered a possible candidate. Same with Sergio Reguilon, we considered him possible, but not really huge losses for Spain there. Okay, let's move on finally, or second last, to predicted starters. So we just have to repopulate the list there. So boop, there it is. And that's our list from above with the highlights cleaned out. So the highlights now will mean whether we think they are starters. And yellow means either we think it's a rotating starter or we're not sure, and that player is a possible starter. So let's begin with that. Well, Louis Enrich, the manager, we'll call him a starter. Let's talk or mention the candidates first. So goalkeepers, we have Unai Simon and Robert Sanchez and David Rea. And we had nominated Simon as the starter in the previous podcast, and that was reaffirmed by his starting both friendlies. So we think they were giving the November friendly start to Robert Sanchez just as a kind of a backup keeper, just a bit of practice. So we are still firm on Unai Simon as the starting keeper. Central defenders, we have Pau Torres, Eric Garcia, and Emeric Laporte. So we had actually nominated Laporte as a starter if he was fit. And, one of several players as his partner. To our surprise, not many players were chosen for central defense. So we're not sure, since Laporte played left back in the November friendly, despite being back since early October. So Pau Torres was used in all recent friendlies, though, so we favour him, and in fact are ready to nominate him as a starter. I'm still tempted to pick Laporte as his partner, but if not, Garcia is in line, and we just don't have evidence for it. So obviously it'll be one of those two, but we lost a bit of faith that it would be Emeric Laporte. Okay, let's move on to left backs, and we have Jordi Alba and Alejandro Balde brought in there to replace Jose Gaya. Yes, in this case, we had predicted that it might be a shared position between Alba and Marcos Alonso, because they had been sharing the position for quite a while. But obviously, we were wrong about Alonso. Gaya seems to have been the intended backup, but then his recent injury. So I wonder if Laporte, who started as left back in the November friendly, is intended as backup. But Laporte already quite busy with his central midfield duties. Anyway, we are going to name Jordi Alba as the starter, kind of by default there. In the right back position, we had predicted a rotation as the starter, and we're going to stick with that, as they seem to share equally. So a rotation between Cesar Azpilicueta and Dani Carvajal, and we're going to stick with that, as I say. Because we can't really determine a starter. Perhaps we give Carvajal the edge because he started the November friendly, but again, one of them had to, so we're not really sure which one between them. Let's move on to the midfield, and we have defensive midfielders Sergi Busquets and Rodri, and we also have Hugo Guillamon. And among those, we again see a rotation between Sergi Busquets and Rodri. My sensibilities kind of favor Sergi Busquets, although there's no kind of evidence for it. Yeah, so we have to kind of name them both as starters there. Kind of rotating starters, or else we're not really sure who will start in the position. So Sergio Busquets and Rodri. Moving on to central midfielders, Carlos Soler we have, and we do think he is going to be a starter. It could be in a couple of positions, though. Sorry, I've lost my spot in the thing. Yes. Initially, though, we hadn't nominated a starter because the rotation among the players was too confusing. That's why we kind of changed it up in this podcast to try to make it more understandable. I'm still not sure about Soler, but because he does play more than one position, we think he'll start. And honestly, with Spain, I think there are very few players who will start all the games. I think they will rotate. So honestly, when we say starters here, we're kind of thinking like 2/3 of the time or so. Okay, let's move to left midfielders. So we hadn't nominated a starter here again because the rotation, there was too much rotation of the position. We did kind of narrow that down to Solar, Pedri, and Koke, and but we can't guess beyond that. We just think it'll be among those three. So I think we'll just highlight them in yellow. There, although wow, it's hard to see these players not starting though. Okay, on the right midfield, we have Gavi, Llorente, and also Solar, which is why we put Solar in green. And I don't think Marcos Llorente starts as much, so I'm going to highlight Gavi in yellow as a possible starter. So among the five of them, we have Solar as a starter, Koke, Pedri, and Gavi as possible starters or rotating starters. And that's how we kind of worked all that out. Okay, let's move on to left forwards. No, left wingers. And here we have Ansu Fati. We don't consider him a starter. And same on the right side, Jeremy Pino. We don't consider him a starter, nor the new candidate, Nico Williams. So let's move on to attacking midfielder and Marco Asensio. And we do consider him, no, we don't consider him a starter, but we do consider him a possible starter. A, because he's played in a couple of positions, and B, because he started two of the most recent friendlies as a centre forward. So we kind of see him as the backup centre forward now. So we think he'll get some starts. Left forwards, we have Dani Olmo and Pablo Sarabia. So we nominated Sarabia as a starter, and the reason for that is kind of like Solar in the midfield. He starts in more than one position, so not necessarily a starter as a left forward, but perhaps as a right forward. Dani Olmo is returning from injury, so we don't think he'll start the first game, but we do think he'll get some starts. So we'll put him as a kind of a possible or sometimes starter. On the right side, though, we have more confidence in Ferran Torres starting, or at least starting enough games to call him a starter. And on the forward position, Alvaro Morata, we had nominated Morata as a starter. And, it does disturb us a little bit that he only started one of the three recent friendlies. That was the second September game. I keep calling them friendlies. Sorry, the September games are Nations League games. Anyway, he did start one of the three, and Asensio started the other two. But that doesn't really shake our confidence that Morata is the starting centre forward. Keep recognizing that he probably won't start every game. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our predictions on the players, and we end with some closing thoughts. And rather than repeating the long conversation we had in the Teams podcast about their prospects, we focus on this question: does the selection change our opinion about their chances? No. They have a few injuries, but those are generally injuries to players, to not really to crucial players. So their most important players remain, and really very little has changed. I got to say, I'm a little bit concerned about three central defenders. I wonder if that could be kind of an Achilles heel here, especially if one of them gets injured. And I don't really see a lot of backup there, because right backs and left backs starting as central defenders, it's a bit of a different position. Perhaps the defensive midfielders acting as backups, but that's kind of a minor concern. They are rich in talent, and we think they will go well beyond the preliminary round. They're not quite the dynasty that Spain was in the early part of the last decade. But we do think they're a very strong team, and we see them going, to about the semi-finals or so. So, okay, so yes, basically the answer is no. Nothing here really changed our opinion about Spain. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this mediacast. And I'll just say keep an eye on us at Soccerphiles Canada. And we have a website at soccerphiles.captivate.fm, but you can begin your navigation if you want more through the show notes or the playlists that you will find on YouTube for us. And we hope to see you in our next mediacast. Bye-bye.